Let me pivot to China, because the US is the largest economy in the world, while China is second largest. I remember during the Cold War, I was in military discussions. You could talk about various weaknesses in US military posture and technology and weapon systems, and we have to do this and do that. And when people were saying that, one way to shut them up was to say, well, would you rather be the Soviet Union? And then they would pause and say, actually, I'd rather be the United States. So whatever our problems are, we have plenty of them in the US, I'd rather be the US than China. China's in even worse shape for different reasons. It's not so much interest rate policy, although they're subject to global interest rate policy and exchange rates coming from the Fed, but you can see it in real estate. It's a full-scale collapse. They're propping it up, but the buyers aren't interested. In other words, the Chinese government is telling the banks to lend money to real estate developers who can't finish housing. Well, that sounds good. It's like, okay, here's some money, finish the housing. But the buyers are not flocking in. The buyers have been burned. They're shying away from that asset class. They want to increase cash. They're looking at other asset classes. They don't have a lot of choices because China has very strict capital controls. They're trying to get their money out by means legal and illegal. They're buying gold when they can. They may, as I say, they may not have a lot of choices, but even money in the bank looks pretty good compared to what's going on in real estate. The problem is too big. The bubble is too large. It's gone on for too long. We don't hear about it the same way we did about the Japanese real estate bubble in 1989, 1990. That was an epic crash. Japan is still not recovered. I remember in the 90s, early 2000s, they talked about the lost decade. Well, try 3 lost decades. That's going into a 4th. That's Japan. 8 or I've lost count, actually 8 or 9 recessions since 1989. But it's really just one long depression. That's the way to understand the Japanese economy. China's going into something like that. We don't hear much about it because they're not transparent. They lie about their numbers. You need to look at private sources and other analytic tools to understand what's going on there. But they've got drops in consumption, industrial output, real estate is collapsing, their price indices are collapsing, all this fear of inflation. It's been around, it's real, but it's now turning around very quickly. And you can see that in China. Chairman Xi is the new Mao Zedong. He's a through and through communist. Look, all the leaders since Mao have been members of the Communist Party, and you're, secretary of the Communist Party of China, among other titles, president of the country, secretary of the party, chairman of the military staff, and for the Politburo and the policy committee of the Politburo. So those titles are the same, but this is different. Chairman Xi kind of broke an unwritten rule that each chairman, each head or president of China had 2 terms. It was a 5-year term. You would have one 5-year term, and then you would have a second 5-year term. But early in the second 5-year term, they would let it be known that there was a chosen successor. And that was so that when the end of your second 5-year term was up, it was a very smooth transition. We already knew who the successor was going to be. Xi Jinping broke the mold. So he got into a second 5-year term, did not appoint a successor, purged his enemies, made it clear that he was going to stay on. And as we approached the 20th National Party Congress, which just concluded about a month ago, they amended the Constitution, and Xi is now starting his 3rd term, but with no end in sight. So he's effectively president for life, a new emperor, a communist emperor, the successor to Mao Zedong. Although he's enough of an egomaniac, give him a little time, he'll somehow elevate himself at a level higher than Mao Zedong. This is the worst possible thing for China. China's going through something that the world has never seen. They're going to lose 600 million people in the next 50 to 70 years. This is a demographic implosion. This is worse than the Black Death, killed somewhere between 1/3 and half the population of Europe. It was a good time for labor, by the way. Labor was so scarce that returns to labor went up versus returns to capital. That's the only thing that can come close. Even the Spanish flu of 1919 killed about, no one's certain of the number, but between 100 million and maybe over 200 million people. But what's going on in China now is worse than any of those things. Simple demographic math. The key number is 2.1. 2 people have to produce 2.1 children, a man and woman, or per woman, if you want, have to produce 2.1 children to keep the population constant. Why not 2? Why not 2 producing 2? The answer is infant mortality and those who don't make it to adulthood and can continue the repopulation of the planet, if you will. But they're not even close to that. They're well below 2. And by the way, so is the rest of the world. So is Australia and the US and Western Europe and a lot of other places. This is a global phenomenon, but it's particularly acute in China. It may be the case that China's birth rate is actually 1. It has to be 2.1 to maintain. It could be 1 or lower. This is a demographic implosion unlike anyone's ever seen. It also has a dynamic. You can't reverse it very quickly. It feeds on itself, as I was talking about inflation earlier. So this is going to continue for 50 to 75 years. They're going to lose 600 million people. There are a lot of definitions of GDP, a 4 or 5 part definition. There are more complex calculations, but there's one really simple definition. It only has 2 factors: population and productivity. How many people are working and how productive are they? That's nominal GDP. That's one definition of gross GDP. Well, if your population is dropping from 1.4 billion to 800 million, you're losing 600 million people. And then what about productivity? Well, the other thing that's going on is China's population is aging very quickly. The number of octogenarians and nonagenarians, people in their 80s and 90s, is exploding. And those age groups are highly correlated with dementia, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's. All 3 of those diseases are non-treatable. Hopefully that'll change someday. But so you get a population of people in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Then you look at the shrinking population between the ages of 25 and 54. It's called their prime working age. More and more of those people are going to have to be involved in elder care. They're going to have to be basically caretakers or caregivers for the older population I described. So if you have a shrinking working age population, a rising older population, high degree of cognitive decline, and a big slice of the working age population having to provide elder care or be caregivers for the older population, tell me where your industrial output's coming from. Tell me where your productivity is coming from. And sorry if I mentioned this already, but 50% of the water in China is poisoned because of just their industrial practices. If you're a gold miner in Australia, I've invested in gold mines around the world. I know that places like Canada, the US, and Australia, if you use cyanide to leach the gold, and that's a very common technique, you have to account for every microgram. Whatever you put in, you got to take out, weigh it, dispose of it properly. In China, they just dump it into the rivers, and so the rivers are poisoned. So China is an economic, demographic, industrial, moral, religious wasteland, and will suffer. It's already in a recession. Just to cut to the chase. Again, they lie about their statistics. So here you have the 2 largest economies in the world, U.S. and China. U.S. is slowly going into what I expect will be a severe recession. China is in a century-long decline, unlike one that the world has ever seen. That could eventually lead to social unrest and regime change, but let's not count on that in the short run. Just expect China to shrink and become more autarkic, decoupled from the Western world, and certainly